A diverse coalition of men, white, black, Latino, came out in droves for Donald Trump in the election just a week ago. Trump saw a 13-point increase this year from 2020. Young men swung toward Trump by nearly 30%, and while deciphering why they voted the way that they did may seem tricky, it's really not.
As journalist Lee Fang writes, quote, young men struggle with addiction, loneliness, and suicide at skyrocketing rates, only to be dehumanized as oppressors by the dominant liberal culture.
Fang further points out how these young men grew up in an era of Me Too, in which phrases toxic masculinity and hegemonic masculinity have frequently been thrown around by the left, leading to the alienation of this group. Here to dive in is independent journalist Lee Fang. Thank you so much for joining us, Lee.
Thanks for having me.
So, I mean, the numbers are fascinating when you really start to dig in. 54% of women voted for Kamala Harris and 55% of men voted for Donald Trump. And you really focus in on just the loneliness of the younger generation. I'm sure that's surrounding things like TikTok and COVID, after COVID, and YouTube shows and, gaming, of course. But women are also going through that loneliness too. So why do you think Trump was able to appeal to young men and not to women in the same way, given that a lot of them are experiencing similar things?
No, that's right. Young women are also experiencing higher rates of loneliness over the last decade, perhaps shaped by the pandemic lockdowns and addiction to phones, what have you. But look, young men in particular are looking to rebel. This is a transgressive demographic. And for young men aged 18 through 29, they've only known a liberal dominated culture in the media, in entertainment, and education that has taught them that they are the oppressor, that where there's kind of ascendant liberal identity politics has dominated most of the cultural sphere. So selecting Donald Trump is really the kind of transgressive move for most young men. He certainly campaigned as the outsider candidate, the anti-establishment candidate. Will he govern as such? That's not clear. Is there a clear policy agenda to help men in terms of improving their lot, working on these loneliness issues, the higher suicide rate, the addiction rate? That's also elusive. But in terms of the identity projected to young men, Donald Trump was the transgressive candidate.
When he won in 2016, Donald Trump, I wrote an article for Reason magazine about how I thought it was partly explained as a backlash against what we were calling political correctness then. Now we call it, wokeness or something like that. We were calling it political correctness back then. And that ended up being the most popular article. I think it's the second most popular article I've ever written. Like it got 1 million views or something. It was clearly an appealing explanation at the time. So I do very much take your point, and that was 8 years ago. People who were young people then are voters now. I think does help to explain what has happened. You talk about, let's get more specific on what we mean by a cultural liberalism. The examples I'm thinking of are the consultants for large corporations or media organizations or entertainment organizations to have commercials be about, the Gillette commercial, or I think it was Gillette, right? The razor commercial about how something's gone wrong with them and they don't really have a place, or traditional manhood doesn't have a place in our society and in our marketing. I think that kind of thing has been very harmful.
I think that's right. And then there's also the call out culture. Me Too started as a very justified, legitimate effort to spotlight high-profile abusers, rapists, people who have taken their position of power and sexually assaulted or otherwise abused women, and it quickly transformed into a call-out culture. It's hard to find a young man who doesn't know someone personally in terms of their classmates or their close personal peer space, who have not been falsely accused in school or on social media. This type of culture is just incredibly toxic. It leads to a backlash. There is a reaction against it. Instead of promoting a form of gender relations that treats everyone with a form of respect and dignity, we've seen this kind of angry witch hunt to find oppressors, to kind of label all young men as hegemonic masculinity, toxic oppressors. The terminology that's bandied around kind of changes from year to year, but it's led men to feel victimized, to say, hey, look, we're struggling too. We're struggling with gambling, with addiction. We're not going to college at the same rates as women. We're not making even as much in many metro areas. For a lot of young men, they're looking side to side and saying, for the dominant culture to call us oppressors, it just doesn't match our reality.
Dominant culture, come on, Lee. I mean, women still make 70% on the dollar as a man. I mean, there is some stuff here that's a little questionable. I mean, do we have to be reactive?
That's certainly true for people above the age of 30, but for young men, for people in their early 20s, in most metro areas, we're seeing a shift where women are making the same amount or even more than men. So that material reality is changing for this generation.
And that's reflective in the fact that young men are not getting higher education, as you mentioned. I'm curious, though, to me it doesn't seem like it's because of Me Too. I feel it's because men are receiving their information from different places than other men that might be, in that 44% that voted for Kamala Harris, and also women, which is, they're on YouTube, as we've discussed many times on the show. YouTube audiences are overwhelmingly male, and they're gaming, which is an overwhelmingly male-dominated field, and they're just receiving information in different places. And so as a result, when you're in these echo chambers, these attitudes can be reinforced. But I'm a woman. I operate around women and men in both those spaces. I'm curious why is the burden being put on the Me Too movement, which is a very legitimate movement, flawed, has been weaponized, I will acknowledge that. Why is the burden being put on the women as the oppressors rather than men taking some responsibility and maybe getting outside of their echo chambers and other men talking to other men about how is it you can be pulled back from these echo chambers?
Well, I don't think the blame falls on any broad group of category. It's not the fault of men. It's not the fault of women. But there are certain activists, certain political leaders, certain political institutions that have painted with a broad brush. There's an empathy gap. Instead of a gender ideology that tries to bring us together, that tries to find the good in all of us. We've seen activist movements and political causes that have attacked young men, that have smeared them, and to make them feel victimized. And above that, in terms of the balkanized media, you're right. We're in a very fragmented media space. But the Kamala campaign, the Democratic campaigns, they haven't taken advantage of it. Kamala had an opportunity to speak to the most popular podcast for young men, Joe Rogan. She was invited on the podcast. She declined the 3-hour interview. She kept changing the goalposts and delaying the interview and eventually essentially declining it. And, for young men, they've grown up in this culture where they remember the liberal activist campaigns to get Joe Rogan removed from Spotify, to get him removed from YouTube. For the Kamala Harris campaign to refuse this interview, it's not just a tactical error. It looks a lot like, for I think a lot of men, Kamala Harris implicitly endorsing the cancellation of Joe Rogan to treat him as too icky. I mean, this was, Joe Rogan on a normal week receives 11 million listeners. During the presidential campaign, it was something like 50 million. I mean, this is many times more. This is exponentially more than any cable news interview or any broadcast media. For a lot of young men, they're primed in the cancel culture wars. This kind of Me Too culture permeates many different institutions. And for the Kamala Harris campaign to mimic the kind of worst tendencies of this movement, I think it's very triggering for young men.
Right, because I also think it's done at the behest of, frankly, a small number of activists and sort of professional consultant, advisor type, educator type people who are brought in by corporations or schools or whatever the institution is, who just have terrible advice for how to wreck the place and make it more hostile for men and women alike, to make people speak to each other in more alien terminology, to have hostility ramp up, and these people are paid tons of money to advise these things, and I think it's that kind of mindset that unfortunately has been has permeated or made its way into some democratic politics in an unfortunate election-killing way. We got to leave it there. Lee Fang, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.